Did you love the lake house I left you? Grandpa asked across the Thanksgiving table. I stared at him. What lake house Mom's fork slipped? Dad went so still he looked carved from stone. Grandpa's smile vanished. The one your grandmother left in trust for you, the one transferred into your name 5 years ago. Dad finally spoke. She agreed to sell it. I never signed anything. Grandpa opened a file and turned the screen toward me. My name was on the deed, dated the week I was working 1,000 miles away. But the forged signature wasn't what made Grandpa whisper, "Call my lawyer." 6 hours before Grandpa asked that question. I was standing in my kitchen with a rent increase notice in one hand and a mug of cold coffee in the other. My landlord was raising the monthly payment again. I had 30 days to sign the new lease or move out. At 29, I worked as a freelance interior designer, which sounded more glamorous than it was. Most nights. I sat at a second-hand desk until 2 in the morning, revising floor plans for clients who paid late but expected instant answers. My car needed a new transmission. My student loans were still hanging over me, and the dental procedure I'd postponed twice had started hurting again. Still, I never asked my parents for money. They had spent years reminding me that independence meant solving my own problems. Dad, Thomas, called my career a creative hobby with invoices. Mom, Lillian, usually softened the insult by adding, "He only worries because your brother has a real business." My younger brother, Dylan, owned an event company my parents praised at every family gathering. He drove a new SUV, rented a polished downtown office, and recently announced that he was expanding. Whenever I asked how he had grown so quickly, Dad would say Dylan understood risk. Apparently, I only understood struggle. The one person who had never treated my dreams like a phase was Grandma Margaret. When I was 12, she let me redesign the tiny attic room at the family lake house. I spent an entire summer painting the walls, rearranging old furniture, and sketching window seats I had no idea how to build. Grandma kept every drawing. One day, she told me, tapping the floor with her cane, "This could be your first real studio," after she died. I asked Dad what would happen to the property. He said the house was falling apart and Grandpa had decided to sell it. Mom told me keeping it would only preserve painful memories. I believed them because grieving people are easy to lie to when the lie sounds practical. I hadn't seen the lake house since the funeral. That Thanksgiving. Grandpa Edward invited everyone to his home. I nearly declined. I was exhausted, worried about rent, and in no mood to listen to Dylan describe another success my parents would use to measure me against. But Grandpa was getting older, so I went. I brought him an old photo album filled with pictures of Grandma at the lake, the moment Mom saw it. She closed the cover and whispered, "Not tonight." Then Grandpa walked in, smiled at the photograph and asked the question that made the entire room stop breathing. Dinner should have felt warm. Grandpa's dining room glowed under soft amber lights, and the table was crowded with turkey, glazed carrots, mashed potatoes, and Grandma's old cranberry recipe. But the longer we sat there, the more I felt like I was watching everyone perform a version of our family that had never really existed. Dad spent most of the meal talking about the renovation he and Mom were planning for their house. New kitchen, new floors, maybe a wine room, he said. Carving the turkey like money had never frightened him. Mom smiled. "We've worked hard. We deserve to enjoy it." Then Dylan announced that his company had just landed its largest contract yet. Dad raised his glass immediately. "To taking risks," he said. Everyone toasted except me. My phone buzzed beneath the table with another message from my landlord reminding me that the new lease had to be signed by Monday. Mom noticed me looking down. "Please don't bring your financial stress to Thanksgiving," she said quietly. I almost laughed. I hadn't said a word. Grandpa changed the subject by opening the album I had brought. He paused at a photograph of Grandma standing on the lake house porch, one arm around 12-year-old me, behind us. The blue shutters were crooked, and I was holding a paintbrush twice the size of my hand. "She loved that place," Grandpa said. "She did," I replied. "And you." "Of course," he smiled. "Then tell me, did you love the lake house I left you?" The room went silent. I thought I had misunderstood him. I haven't seen it since Grandma died. Mom's fork struck her plate. Dad leaned forward. Edward, this isn't the time. Grandpa's expression changed. What exactly isn't the time for Dad wiped his mouth slowly. Angelina decided she didn't want the property. It was too painful. So we handled the sale. I stared at him. You told me Grandpa sold it because it was falling apart. Mom reached for my hand, but I pulled away. It was complicated, she whispered. Grandpa stood and walked into his office. He returned with his tablet and opened a scanned document. The house was placed in trust for Angelina. He said, Thomas was authorized to maintain it, not sell it. Dad's face tightened. She signed the consent. Grandpa turned the screen toward me. There it was, my full name beneath a notarized signature. The document claimed I had signed it in Portland on March 18th. I felt the blood drain from my face. On March 18th, I had been in Chicago, presenting a design project in front of 80 people. There were photographs, employment records, even a hotel receipt proving it. I looked at Dad. Where did the money go? He said nothing. Then Dylan lowered his eyes, and I realized his silence was an answer. Grandpa took me into his study before anyone could follow. The moment the door closed, the noise from the dining room vanished, but the silence inside me only grew louder. I should have asked you directly, he said. I trusted your father to follow the trust exactly as your grandmother intended. I stared at the photograph on his desk, Grandma laughing beside the lake. Sunlight caught in her silver hair. They watched me struggle. I whispered. They knew I was borrowing money just to keep my apartment. Grandpa's face hardened. Then we find out everything. The next morning, we met Naomi Carter, an attorney who handled trust disputes and property fraud. She offered no easy promises. She read the documents twice, then placed them in 3 neat stacks. The trust names you as the sole beneficiary, she said. Your father could maintain the property, pay taxes, and handle insurance. He could not sell it. She tapped the signature page. If this signature is forged, the transaction may be void, but recovering the house depends on whether the buyer knew the sale was improper. That became our first question. The second was where the money had gone. Within days, Naomi obtained the closing file, bank records, and original power of attorney. My signature had been notarized in Portland while I was working in Chicago. The sale price was nearly $500,000 below the appraised value. The buyer was a company controlled by Raymond Cole, one of Dad's former business partners. Then the bank records arrived. $420,000 had gone into Dad's failing construction company. Another large transfer became the down payment on my parents' house. Money flowed into Dylan's event business. The rest paid for vehicles, vacations, and credit cards. Every luxury they displayed came from a place Grandma had meant for me. I still offered them one chance. Naomi arranged a private meeting. I asked for the truth, a full accounting, and their cooperation in restoring either the property or its value. I also asked them to stop involving Dylan and the rest of the family. Dad leaned back. You're treating this like theft. It was theft. Mom started crying. We saved this family. Dylan looked at me as if I were destroying his life. If you freeze those accounts, my company is finished. I didn't fund your company, I said. You were funded with something taken from me. They refused every term. 2 days later, Naomi called. Dad was transferring assets. Mom had begun telling relatives I wanted to make them homeless. Money was moving into Dylan's company before we could trace it. When I confronted Dad, he answered coldly. You were never going to use that lake house anyway. That sentence ended whatever part of me still wanted reconciliation. You didn't decide what I needed, I said. You decided what you could take. Then I turned to Naomi. File everything. Naomi filed the complaint the next morning. By Friday, the court had temporarily blocked my parents from moving money, selling their house, or shifting assets into Dylan's company. Dad called it an ambush. Mom called it cruelty. Dylan left one message. You're burning down everyone's life over a house you forgot existed. I saved it. 3 weeks later, we sat across from one another in a mandatory settlement conference. Naomi and I were on one side of a long table. Grandpa sat beside his trust attorney. Across from us were Dad, Mom, Dylan, Raymond Cole, and 3 lawyers. Dad began confidently. Angelina knew about the sale. He said. She gave verbal approval, then signed the consent. She only changed her story after learning the property's value. Naomi placed 5 folders on the table. Let's begin with March 18th. The first contained my flight itinerary, hotel bill, employee badge record, and photographs of me presenting a hotel redesign in Chicago. One showed me beside a digital clock at 2:14 p.m. The sale documents claimed I had appeared before a Portland notary at 1:40 that afternoon. Dad stared at the image. His attorney asked. Was the signature witnessed in person? Raymond's lawyer shifted. Naomi opened the second folder. The notary testified that Mr. Brooks delivered documents already bearing Angelina's signature. She never met Angelina, Mom whispered. Thomas. Dad cut her off. I had authority to sign for her. That brings us to the third folder. Naomi slid forward the power of attorney. Grandpa's lawyer read the language aloud. It allowed Dad to pay taxes, renew insurance, and arrange repairs. It specifically prohibited a sale, transfer, mortgage, or change of beneficiary. Grandpa looked at his son. You knew exactly what that document allowed. Dad's jaw tightened. I did what was necessary, for whom I asked. He ignored me. Raymond's attorney claimed his client had trusted Dad and purchased the house in good faith. Naomi opened the fourth folder. The first email was from Dad to Raymond. Angelina won't be attending. We need to close before Edward starts asking questions. Raymond had replied, as long as the family keeps this internal. I'm fine proceeding. The room changed. Raymond turned toward Dad. You told me she had agreed, Dad snapped, and you knew enough not to ask. Raymond's lawyer put a hand on his arm, but the damage was done. The lake house had been appraised near $1.6 million. Raymond's company bought it for $1.1 million through a private closing, without open marketing or direct contact with the trust's beneficiary. You didn't buy a clean title, Naomi told him. You bought silence at a discount. Then came the final folder. A chart traced every dollar. $420,000 had gone into Dad's construction company. $280,000 became the down payment on my parents' house. $190,000 funded Dylan's event business. The rest covered cars, travel, taxes, and credit cards. For years. My parents had displayed those things as proof of discipline. They had built their success from my stolen inheritance. Dylan stared at the transfer. I didn't know it came from the lake house. Did you know Grandma left the house to me? I asked. He said nothing. Dylan. His eyes met mine. Dad said you didn't need it. And that was enough. I thought you agreed. You never asked. Mom started crying. We were trying to keep the family together. I turned toward her. When my car broke down, you told me to be responsible. When my rent increased, you said adulthood was expensive. When I borrowed a deposit from Clara, you called me dramatic. Her face folded. You knew. You watched me struggle with money that came from my own house. Dad struck the table. We raised you. We paid for clothes, braces, food, everything. Don't act like we gave you nothing. I felt the old instinct to shrink and make the room comfortable for everyone else. It passed. You were my parents, I said. Providing for a child did not purchase ownership of her adulthood. Grandpa removed his glasses. What hurts most, he told Dad, is that you used your mother's name to excuse this? Dad looked away. You told me Angelina wanted the house sold because the memories were too painful. Grandpa continued. You let me believe she rejected Margaret's final gift. I was protecting everyone. Dad muttered. No, you were protecting yourself. Grandpa announced that Dad had been removed from every trust, property, and financial role. His inheritance documents had already been revised. Future communication about family assets would go through counsel for the first time. Dad looked afraid. The conference ended without settlement. Months later, the court ruled that my signature had been forged. Dad's authority deliberately exceeded, and Raymond had enough warning to know the transaction was improper. The deed was canceled. The lake house returned to the trust and was transferred into my name. Raymond could pursue Dad for the purchase money. My parents' assets remained frozen until restitution and legal fees were secured. They had to sell their house. Dylan returned the unspent investment and restructured his company with legitimate loans. Outside the courthouse, Mom caught my arm. "Are you really going to let us lose our home I pulled free? I gave you a chance to tell the truth." Dad stepped closer. "You're choosing a building over your family." "No, you chose money over your daughter. I'm choosing not to pay for that choice anymore." Naomi opened the courthouse door. Grandpa waited beside her. I walked past my parents without celebrating, shouting, or looking back. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the cost of keeping our family's secrets. The first time I returned to the lake house, I stood outside with the new deed in one hand and Grandma's old photo album in the other. The blue shutters had faded. Weeds had swallowed part of the stone path. But when I opened the door, the house still smelled faintly of pine, dust, and the lavender soap Grandma used to keep beside the kitchen sink. Upstairs, the attic walls were still painted the pale green I had chosen at 12. Near the window, pencil marks recorded my height through 5 summers. That was when I finally cried. Not because the house was worth more than $1 million. I cried because my parents had nearly convinced me that Grandma's promise had never existed. I restored the attic first and turned it into a design studio. I named the business Margaret House Design. And Clara became my first project partner, within months. I was working beside the same window where Grandma once saved every crooked sketch I made. My parents sold their oversized home to satisfy the judgment and legal costs. Dad lost every financial role Grandpa had ever trusted him with. Mom stopped calling after I refused to argue with relatives she had recruited against me. Dylan returned the remaining money and downsized his company. Months later, he sent me a letter admitting he had benefited because asking questions might have cost him everything. I didn't forgive him immediately. An apology could open a door. It could not erase what happened behind it. Grandpa visited one quiet Sunday carrying Grandma's old wooden toolbox. He placed it on my desk and said, "I should have asked you sooner." I looked around the room she had always believed would become mine. "You asked when it mattered," I said. Then I hung our photograph above the drafting table not as proof of what my family had stolen, but as a reminder of what they had failed to take. I used to think keeping the peace meant staying silent. Now I know silence only protects the people who benefit from it. My parents took more than a house. They took my right to choose, then expected me to carry the guilt when I took it back. I didn't destroy my family. I simply stopped shielding them from the consequences of their own decisions. What would you have done in my place, taken them to court, or walked away? Tell me below, and subscribe for more stories where quiet betrayal finally meets real accountability.